Time magazine called him the unsung hero behind the internet. CNN called him a father of the internet. President Bill Clinton called him one of the great minds of the information age. He has been voted history's greatest scientist of African descent. He is Philip Emeagwali. He's coming to Trinidad and Tobago to launch the 2008 Kwame Ture lecture series on Sunday, June 8th at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine, 5 p.m. The Emancipation Support Committee invites you to come and hear this inspirational mind adjust the theme, crossing new frontiers to conquer today's challenges. This lecture is one you cannot afford to miss. Admission is free, so be there on Sunday, June 8th, 5 p.m. at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine.
I'm Philip Emeagwali. On June 20, 1974, in Corvallis, Oregon, USA, I began my search for the new knowledge of how off-the-shelf processors could be harnessed and used in tandem to create the world's fastest computer. I discovered that such a supercomputer will not be a computer in and of itself. It will be a new internet in reality. I imagined that new internet as my new global network of processors that were identical and uniformly distributed across the surface of a globe, but distributed just as computers are distributed around the earth. My search for the fastest supercomputer demanded that I begin from the beginning, which is the laws of physics that existed since the Big Bang explosion, or the small singularity that inflated over the past 13.8 billion years and inflated to become the present cosmos. In my 2-decade-long quest, I scourged the history of physics, then of calculus and algebra, and mastered the frontiers of knowledge of those three important subjects. That mastery enabled me to harness the total and maximum supercomputing power of my coupled ensemble of the 2 raised to power 16 slowest processors in the world. Those off-the-shelf processors were designed for a mainstream market rather than for supercomputing, and they were manufactured in large numbers and for a lower price. My most significant contribution to computer science is this. I discovered that 1 million processors can power supercomputers. In an email, a 12-year-old writing the biographies of great inventors and their inventions asked me, "What is Philip Emeagwali known for?" I'm known for discovering that up to 1 billion off-the-shelf processors can power the world's fastest computers. In the 1980s, I was ridiculed for pursuing the then useless technology of the first world's fastest computing across the slowest processors in the world. But by 1989, I was in the news for discovering fastest computing with slowest processing. After my discovery, vector supercomputer scientists who had ignored me wanted to become my new best friends. That invention of computing with millions of processors put a black African face in science classrooms and alongside the faces of Galileo, Isaac Newton, and Albert Einstein. My contribution to computer science was how I chipped away at one of the fundamental assumptions of the myth of white intellectual superiority. Such myths were sincere fictions of the white self, fictions that only white males, the likes of Albert Einstein, were endowed with the intellect that was needed to make substantial contributions to human knowledge and to solve the most challenging problems at the frontiers of knowledge of the fields of mathematics, physics, and computer science. Those sincere fictions legitimized IQ science and white power. Furthermore, those sincere fictions legitimized white privileges, including favoring the immigration and hiring of Western and Northern European scientists over Black sub-Saharan African scientists. Not only that, those sincere fictions legitimized attacking affirmative action policies that would have produced more African American supercomputer scientists who could have contributed to making parallel and quantum supercomputers faster. Over the decades, those sincere fictions became the status quo. I discovered the world's fastest computing across the slowest processors in the world, and did so on the 4th of July, 1989. Before my discovery, it was assumed that Albert Einstein is more intelligent and more knowledgeable than Philip Emeagwali. The reverse now holds across genius rankings posted on the internet. Historically, the Black invention was rarely understood in the racial context it was made. Looking back to June 20, 1974, the day I began programming one of the world's fastest computers that was at 1800 Southwest Campus Way, Corvallis, Oregon, USA. The toughest part about being a marginalized Black computer scientist was that I was expected to repress my oppressed identity. As a mathematical physicist, I always knew that the laws of logic and physics are experienced the same way by Black and white persons. In 1974, I conceived the first world's fastest computing across a new ensemble of 64,000 processors. I visualized my new technology as encircling a globe, and doing so just as what we later called the internet now encircles the earth. In May 1981, in College Park, Maryland, I embarked on my mathematical quest for how to solve the most compute-intensive problems that needed to be solved on the world's fastest computers. In 1981, the open mathematical question was this: can mathematicians solve an initial boundary value problem, such as simulating the flows of crude oil, injected water, and natural gas that are buried up to 7.7 miles or 12.4 kilometers deep and within an oil-producing field that is almost twice the size of Anambra State, of the state of Anambra, Nigeria? And can we hindcast or reforecast those fluid flows across a new internet that's a new spherical island of up to 1 billion off-the-shelf processors? Each processor had its dedicated memory. That difficult problem was at the crossroad where new physics new mathematics and new computer science intersect. In the 1980s, the US government classified that problem as one of the 20 grand challenges in supercomputing. Solving the most intractable problems that arise simultaneously in mathematics or physics or computer science demands a higher mental power than writing a poem or a play or a novel. That demand is akin to the belief that lifting a car demands physical strength. The research computational mathematician who can solve or parallel process the toughest problems that arise in extreme scale computational physics is believed to have a stronger brain muscle or a higher mental power or a higher IQ than those who cannot. Solving the most difficult problems in mathematics and physics are the reasons Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein are in the perennial list of the smartest people that ever lived. For me, the early 1980s was my period of a quote-unquote hand proofs that delineated my paths from the blackboard to the motherboard and across my new internet that I visualized as a new global network of 64 binary thousand processors. That was when and why I coded the processor-to-processor email algorithms, which I invented for solving the resulting huge system of equations of computational linear algebra. That was how I constructed my message past 65,536 processor codes. I invented those processor codes for solving the most difficult problems at the frontiers of knowledge, of mathematics, physics, and computer science. What made the news headlines in 1989 was that I executed those 65,536 codes at once and across a global network of 65,536 processors that I visualized as a new internet. In the 1980s, I experimented across an ensemble of the slowest processors in the world and across an internet that's a global network of those processors. Those processors were identical and were equal distances apart. Each processor had its dedicated memory that shared nothing. I executed my experiments that yielded the first world's fastest computing across the slowest processors in the world, and did so by using the initial boundary value problems in weather forecasting and in petroleum reservoirs modeling, and using both difficult mathematical problems as my computational test beds. My new speed from my world's slowest processor experiments was the world's fastest computation. I recorded that speed at 8:15 in the morning of the 4th of July, 1989, in Los Alamos, New Mexico, USA. My supercomputing discovery led to a new understanding of how millions of processors could be harnessed and used to make the fastest computer and make the supercomputer practical in addressing some of the world's most important and complex challenges. Such difficult mathematical problems include more accurate weather forecasts, powering the world with green energy and manufacturing efficient and safer automobiles and personalized medicine that extends lifespans. That new understanding led to the world's fastest computer that's not supercomputing with one processor. We now understand the world's fastest computer as supercomputing across millions of processors. My major contribution to computer science is this: I was the first person to record the fastest computer speed and do so alone. On the 4th of July 1989, I was confident that I've discovered the first world's fastest computing across the slowest processors in the world, and that I've solved one of the most compute-intensive problems in computer science. In the 1980s, the first world's fastest computing across the slowest processors in the world was an unknown field of computer science. I was the only known expert that could solve the most compute-intensive problems in mathematics and physics. I discovered how to solve the most difficult problems across up to 1 billion coupled processors. That was the reason I became the first person to record the fastest computer speeds and do so across my ensemble of 65,536 coupled processors. At first, my discovery of the fastest computing across the slowest processors was ridiculed and rejected. Not only that, I was dismissed because non-experts were asked to review the fastest computer speed, which I recorded across my ensemble of 65,536 coupled processors. I was the only person that understood my discovery. Furthermore, I described that discovery in my 1,057-page research report that only I understood. That should not come as a surprise because I was the first and sole full-time programmer of the biggest supercomputer ever built. Such supercomputers now occupy the footprint of a football field, and it costs 40% more than the mile-long Second Niger Bridge in Nigeria. The billion-dollar price tag ensures that supercomputing will never become a child's play. 3 often asked questions are: what is the Philip Emeagwali computer? How did Philip Emeagwali invent the world's fastest computing? How were the Philip Emeagwali equations reformulated from calculus to algebra? The 9 Philip Emeagwali equations that I invented were abstract and differential, and they were the most advanced expressions in calculus and were difficult to understand. I discretized those partial differential equations by using partial difference schemes that I invented. That was how I reduced them from a system of equations of calculus to a seemingly infinite system of equations of computational linear algebra, which I solved across my ensemble of the slowest 65,536 processors in the world. In the 1970s and 80s, I knew that the world's fastest computer speed was a technological achievement that could be measured in the manner the speed of a marathoner is measured with tapes and watches. But in calculus, the watches are soft and genius is subjective. On the 4th of July 1989, I was challenged to submit my discovery of the world's fastest computing across the slowest processors in the world and allow my new knowledge to be retested by the foremost experts in supercomputing. I accepted that challenge and took my discovery to a 15-day supercomputer workshop that took place between September 1 and 15 of 1989 and in the outskirts of Chicago, Illinois. At that supercomputer workshop, my discovery was discussed by programmers who had programmed vector supercomputers and hoping to program parallel supercomputers. After that 15-day supercomputer workshop, a sense of anticipation arose from my discovery that the world's fastest computing can be extracted from the slowest processors in the world. By the end of that supercomputer conference, the consensus was that my discovery deserved to be recognized by the highest award in supercomputing for the year 1989. But a few naysayers openly challenged me to resubmit my discovery to the committee of judges who awarded the most prestigious prize in supercomputing. That award committee was appointed by the two top computer societies in the world, the Computer Society of the IEEE, or the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, and the Association for Computing Machinery. In December 1989, I submitted my scientific discovery of the world's fastest computing to the Computer Society of the IEEE in San Francisco, California. I won that prize in supercomputing that computer scientists rank as the Nobel Prize of Supercomputing. That discovery and the prize generated the news headlines: African supercomputer genius wins top US prize. Winning that top supercomputing prize gave me credibility and a handle. That most prestigious prize separated me from the other 25,000 vector supercomputer scientists. A coveted prize was the quote-unquote scientific evidence that my supercomputer discovery of how to execute the world's fastest calculations and do so across up to 1 billion coupled processors and solve the most compute-intensive problems in mathematics and science. It was an undeniable proof that I made an original contribution to the development of the world's fastest supercomputer that now computes faster with millions of processors. That top supercomputing prize made me stand out in the community of prominent mathematicians and top physicists. My discovery of the first world's fastest computing across the slowest processors in the world changed the way mathematicians and physicists use the supercomputers to solve compute-intensive problems in their fields. My discovery of supercomputing across the slowest processors was new knowledge that inspired vector supercomputer scientists to change the way they look at the fastest computers. The chances of a supercomputer scientist winning the highest award in supercomputing and winning that prize alone was only 1 in 25,000. With the exception of myself, that most prestigious award or diploma in supercomputing was shared by up to 50 supercomputer scientists. 50 names were inscribed on their award diploma. It was like 50 persons sharing one diploma. In the 1980s, I was the only full-time programmer of the most massively parallel supercomputer ever constructed. That supercomputer is the precursor of the world's fastest computer of today. Being the first person to discover something is better than being the best person in doing that thing. On July 4, 1989, I became the first person to discover that parallel computing is faster than sequential computing. It's faster when both technologies are used to solve the world's most compute-intensive problems, such as modeling climate change. That breakthrough opened the gate to the widespread use of millions of processors to power the world's most powerful supercomputers. In 1989, I stood out because I was the first person to win the highest award in supercomputing and win it alone. I was the first person to win that prize for solving the most compute-intensive problem in supercomputing. This year, the highest award in supercomputing was shared by 28 co-winners. That prize enabled me to stake massively parallel computing as Philip Emeagwali territory and as the place where the fastest computers exist. My scientific discovery of world's fastest computing was validated and replicated across the ensemble of millions of processors that define and outline state-of-the-art supercomputers. The $45 billion a year market value of the world's fastest computers affirms the importance of using up to 1 billion processors to power every supercomputer. It should be noted that the world's fastest computing is the supreme validation of a new supercomputer. A scientific discovery is a personal property that becomes public property if and only if it's disclosed to the public. I transferred the ownership of my discovery of the world's fastest computing across the slowest processors in the world and signed it over on 3 disclosure occasions: July 4, September 15, and December 25, 1989. The scientific community responded to those disclosures of my discovery and did so by awarding me the highest award in supercomputing. That supreme validation was time-stamped for the year 1989. I've shared 1,000 videos on YouTube. My videotaped lectures are my compression of 5 decades of scientific research into a series of 1-hour remarks. It's akin to compressing my life story into a parable. I couldn't describe everything that I know within 1,000 hours. I only presented the crux of my contribution to my new internet. That's a new supercomputer intrinsically. It cost more than $1 billion to create the world's fastest computer, but it cost nothing to listen to my lecture on how I discovered how to execute the fastest computer speed and how to do so across up to 1 billion processors, which outline and define the world's fastest computer. For me, June 20, 1974, in Corvallis, Oregon, USA, was the beginning of my long train of thoughts and experiments across a new spherical island of 65,536 off-the-shelf processors and standard parts. Those processors were identical. I visualized those processors as uniformly distributed across a globe. I defined my ensemble of coupled processors as a never-before visualized internet that encircles a globe, and that's a small copy of the internet that encircles the earth. In 1989, I was in the news because I discovered how to harness my new internet and used the new technology as one seamless, coherent, and gigantic machinery that's the world's fastest computer in reality, but not a computer in and of itself. I didn't invent my new internet in one day back on June 20, 1974. Nor was I instantaneously struck with the 9 Philip Emeagwali equations. I solved my system of partial differential equations beyond the frontier of calculus, and I solved them via their companion partial difference equations of large-scale computational linear algebra. I solved them in my thoughts and solved them during the experiments that I executed across my ensemble of 65,536 processors. Those processors were identical and surrounded a globe as a new internet. The inklings of parallel computing I had in 1974 grew from a mere acorn to a mighty oak tree that was the fastest computation across a new internet. The new internet is a new global network of coupled processors sharing nothing and uniformly distributed around a globe. It made the news because I discovered how to harness those slow processors as a supercomputer. On the 4th of July, 1989, I discovered how to use up to 1 billion processors to solve the most compute-intensive problems in mathematics and physics, such as global climate modeling. In the 1970s and 80s, harnessing 1 million processors and using them to solve the most compute-intensive mathematical problems was supercomputing's equivalence of being the first person to summit Mount Everest. As an aside, the first climbers who made it to the top of Mount Everest did so in 1953. Since then, only 5,000 climbers climbed to the summit of Mount Everest. By comparison, only one person single-handedly recorded the world's fastest computer speed across the slowest processors in the world. In high-performance supercomputing, recording the world's fastest speed is the most coveted milestone. In the 1980s, the fastest speed in computing recorded across the slowest processors was a milestone that 25,000 supercomputer scientists dreamt to achieve. That fastest parallel supercomputer was a milestone in the history of mathematics and computer science. I was the first and only person that benchmarked that milestone successfully. I benchmarked it on the 4th of July, 1989. It made the news headlines that a Nigerian supercomputer genius in the USA had recorded the fastest speed in the history of computing. I recorded that speed across the slowest processors in the world, and I recorded that speed while solving the most compute-intensive problems in the world. To put my supercomputer invention from a literal perspective, writing a novel or a book takes a couple of years, and up to 1 million new books are published each year in the USA alone. And reading and critiquing my supercomputer invention of how the fastest supercomputer can be built with the slowest processors is as easy as spending time on Facebook or WhatsApp. The grand challenge in deeply understanding my contribution to the highest performance supercomputing was to spend $1 billion to reconstruct the massively parallel supercomputer that will be needed to recreate my world's fastest computation. And most importantly, test that world's fastest computation on production petroleum reservoir simulations that are executed across millions of off-the-shelf processors. And finally, recreate that fastest speed as mandated by the scientific method that characterized natural science since the 17th century. My scientific discovery of the fastest computing across the slowest processors changed the way mathematicians solve the 20 most difficult mathematical problems in science, engineering, and medicine, and changed it from solving one problem at a time to solving up to 1 billion problems at once. Changing the way we count is a fundamental change of tectonic proportions and a shift that has occurred only once in the 200,000 years of the existence of humanity. In the 1980s, I used more supercomputers than any person ever did. I alone was the only full-time programmer of 16 massively parallel supercomputers that were each powered by up to the 65,536 slowest processors in the world. The massively parallel supercomputers of the 1980s were abandoned because they were then mocked, ridiculed, and dismissed as a tremendous waste of everybody's time. Back then, the supercomputer textbooks wrote that it will forever remain impossible to solve the most compute-intensive problems and solve them at the fastest speeds and solve them across an ensemble of the slowest processors in the world. In 1989, I was in the news because I proved everybody wrong and did so by solving the most compute-intensive problems and solving them with the slowest processors and solving them at the fastest possible speeds. That was how the fastest computing across the slowest processors became my signature discovery and became one reason I'm the subject of biographical essays on famous inventors and their inventions. My contributions to developing the world's fastest computers were these. I discovered that a binary billion processors that were locked together can be programmed to emulate one seamless coherent machinery. That's a supercomputer in reality. A binary billion is 2 raised to power 32, or 4,294,967,296. I discovered that the number of processors needed is proportional to the compute intensiveness of the mathematical problem. More often than not, the most compute-intensive problems arise as variations in physics calculations, particularly in geophysical and astrophysical fluid dynamics. The physics roots, as well as the mathematical and computational structures of the global climate model, differ slightly from that of the petroleum reservoir simulation. I presented reservoir simulation in my 1989 discovery, for which I won the highest award in supercomputing. Climate and reservoir modeling are the prototypical problems of large-scale geophysical and astrophysical fluid dynamics. The supercomputer enables medical and scientific discoveries to occur at the fastest pace. It's used to pull the future closer. The world's fastest computers were used to discover how COVID-19 spreads. My discovery of the world's fastest computing across the slowest processors in the world made the news headlines in 1989 and made it impractical to continue selling outmoded supercomputers that were powered by only one processor. Within 5 years after my discovery, the manufacturers of vector supercomputers couldn't sell that technology. For those reasons, they ran out of funds, laid off their employees, and filed for bankruptcy protection from creditors, and filed it under Chapter 11 of the US Federal Bankruptcy Code. The world's fastest computer is not a child's play. It occupies the footprint of a football field. It costs 40% more than the mile-long Second Niger Bridge in Nigeria. It's the world's most complex invention. The world's fastest computer is powered by up to 1 billion processors. Each processor had its operating system. Each processor shared nothing with its nearest neighboring processors. That first supercomputer that's used to solve the toughest mathematical problems and solve them fastest across the slowest processors is described as the most complex creation of the human mind. Nigeria has 159 oil fields and 1,481 oil wells. The first oil field in West Africa was discovered in 1956 in Oloibiri, Nigeria. The oldest oil well in Nigeria was sunk in 1958. Oloibiri was a fishing and farming community that's a distance of 45 miles or 72.4 kilometers east of Port Harcourt. The Oloibiri oil field covered an area of 5.31 square miles. Only half of the crude oil discovered in Oloibiri was recorded, or rather was recoverable. 20 years after that first oil well in Oloibiri was sunk, that first oil field in Nigeria was abandoned. The warning from Oloibiri is that the 159 producing oil fields of Nigeria will dry out in 20 or 30 or 40 years. In 50 years, Nigeria will not be an oil-producing country, and Nigeria will be dismissed from OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. I'm often asked, what is the Philip Emeagwali computer? Why is Philip Emeagwali known for fastest computers? And what is the influence of calculus on the development of the computer? In June 1970, I claimed, or rather reclaimed, my mathematical language. And I did so when I bought the 568-page blue hardbound book that was titled An Introduction to the Infinitesimal Calculus. That calculus book was written by G.W. George William Count and published by Oxford University Press. In developing the world's fastest computer, calculus was the pink elephant in the room that nobody wanted to talk about. The secret to my 1989 world's fastest computing was that I discovered how to divide and solve the most compute-intensive problems in calculus. I divided it into an equivalent set of less compute-intensive problems that I solved across my ensemble of 65,536 processors. My processors computed in tandem and were in dialogue with each other. At first, and in the 1970s, I was confused because I did not know where each processor was located at. The one vertex of a 16-dimensional cube to one processor correspondence gave me an intuitive understanding of where each processor was located. That new knowledge enabled me to record the fastest speed in computer history. In the history of the computer, we expect the next generation of computers to be 10 times faster. I discovered a billion-fold increase in the speed of the world's fastest computer that's powered by a billion processors. To invent a supercomputer is to take a big risk and leapfrog into the future. An often asked question was this: what is Philip Emeagwali known for? I'm known as the first person that figured out how to solve the most compute-intensive problems that are important to society. Such intractable problems are governed by a system of coupled, nonlinear, time-dependent, and three-dimensional partial differential equations that are beyond the frontier of calculus. Such partial differential equations must be discretized or reduced to an almost equivalent system of equations that's the largest in computational linear algebra. I was in the news because I was the first person that parallel processed across an ensemble of 64 binary thousand off-the-shelf processors that were identical and coupled to each other. In the 1970s and 80s, I thought of myself as a research computational mathematician, searching for the world's most powerful supercomputer, In those 2 decades, my goal was to execute the fastest floating point arithmetic operations that must be used to solve the world's most compute-intensive problems in science, engineering, and medicine. That was how and why I searched for and discovered the fastest arithmetical computations and searched for and discovered new algebraic knowledge and searched for and discovered new partial differential equations of calculus. I'm Philip Emeagwali. I create new equations the way Bob Marley writes new songs. I sing in the mathematical dialect of the universe. My quest for new mathematical knowledge was a personal search for the lost language of God. In my quest for the never-before-seen supercomputer that's the fastest ever, I encoded the second law of motion of physics into the partial differential equations of calculus. I then discretized those partial differential equations into corresponding and approximating partial difference equations of large-scale algebra. Finally, I developed my 65,536 computer codes, which I used in a one code to one problem corresponding manner, and used to solve each of my 65,536 subsets of those systems of equations of large-scale algebra. I translated the world's biggest mathematical problems and did so from prose to the supercomputer circles which I executed to solve those compute-intensive equations that would otherwise be impossible to solve. In 1989, I was in the news because I was the first person to figure out how to compute across 2 raised to power 16 or 64 binary thousand, quote unquote, little computers called processors that surrounded a globe. I visualized my globe as embedded within the 16th dimensional hyperspace. My ensemble of processors encircled that 16th dimensional globe and did so in the way the internet encircles the earth. My supreme quest for ultra-fast computations from the world's fastest computer was like launching 65,536 or 2 raised to power 16 digital arrows into the unknown 16-dimensional hyperspace. Each arrow carried an email message to a 16-bit long address and across 16 times 2 raised to power 16 pathways that had a one-to-one correspondence with as many bidirectional edges of the cube in the 16th dimensional hyperspace. Visualizing the world's fastest computer that I discovered in the 1980s and imagining the technology as a new internet within the 16th dimension was published as science fiction back on February 1, 1922. But on the 4th of July, 1989, I figured out how to turn that science fiction to non-fiction. Fastest computing across lowest processors is my contribution to the supercomputer that occupies the space of a soccer field, and it costs more than the mile-long Second Niger Bridge in Nigeria. In my supercomputing, I computed in parallel rather than in sequence, or solved up to 1 billion problems at once rather than solve one problem at a time. I was asked, how do you want to be remembered? The contribution of Philip Emeagwali to the development of extremely fast computers is this. I was in the news in 1989 for discovering that the world's fastest computers must be powered by up to 1 billion processors. Prior to my discovery that occurred on the 4th of July 1989, the fastest computing across the slowest processors existed only in science fiction. I want to be remembered for the first world's fastest computer that was powered by the slowest processors in the world. I'm studied in schools because I'm the first person to know some things in mathematics, physics, and computer science that were not known to anybody before me. My quest for the world's fastest computer was like flirting with the infinite. Looking back, my failures were the price that I paid for my successes. Short-term failures are necessary, but not sufficient conditions for long-term successes. My contribution to computer science is this. I was the first eyewitness to the fundamental shift that yielded our new understanding of the world's fastest computer. The new supercomputer is an ensemble of up to 1 billion processors that each operated its operating system. I recorded the world's fastest computer speed. More importantly, I did so while solving the most important and most compute-intensive problems known to humanity and solving them across a new internet. My internet was a new global network of the slowest processors in the world. I visualized my supercomputer as outlined and defined by 2 raised to power 16 off-the-shelf processors that each had its dedicated memory. Furthermore, I visualized those processors as equal distances apart. Likewise, I visualized those processors as etched onto the hypersurface of a globe. I visualized that globe as embedded within a 16-dimensional hyperspace. That global network of processors is called the Philip Emeagwali Internet. Not only that, I fulfilled my part of the tacit requirement that every scientist from Einstein to Emeagwali who contributed to science must share his or her new knowledge on YouTube. In an email, a 14-year-old writing an essay on famous scientists and their discoveries asked me to describe how I want to be remembered. As an aside, 95% of my supercomputer research notebooks that began on June 20, 1974 in Corvallis, Oregon, USA, are unpublished. But they should be published and remembered. I want my unpublished writings, handwritten notes, and unpublished lectures and conversations to be digitized, duplicated, and archived in the USA. They should be made public in Nigeria on my 200th anniversary or on August 23 of the year 2154. I want to be remembered for discovering how to map the complex problems of physics across the millions of processors that power the world's most powerful computers. I want to be remembered for discovering how to solve mathematical problems that will be otherwise unsolvable both on the earth and in the heavens. Thank you.
insightful and brilliant lecture.